The Bozeman Trail in the winter of 1889 was not a road. It was a 140-mile open grave where the frost stripped the flesh from a traveler's bones long before their heart actually stopped beating. Along the most exposed ridge of this northern Wyoming Territory, the wind scoured the earth until the soil was as hard and gray as iron. On this morning, the sky hung low, a heavy, silent witness to the solitary journey of Marta Solvorn. She was 29 years old, with the steady hands and quiet eyes of her father, Arn, a boat builder from the deep, ice-choked waters of the Hardanger Fjord. Marta sat on the rough wooden seat of a battered farm wagon, her fingers wrapped in thick, greasy wool mitts. She was driving a single dark draft mule named Surtur, whose ribs showed slightly beneath his coarse winter coat. It had been 6 days since she left Billings, Montana. Behind her lay the wreckage of a life she had tried to build with her husband, a man whose dreams had been larger than his strength, leaving behind only debts and a quiet grave in the clay of the Gallatin Valley. The creditors had taken almost everything, leaving Marta with only what could fit in this single wagon. Under the stiff canvas tarp behind her lay her entire world: a canvas bedroll, 2 worn gray wool blankets, a cast-iron Dutch oven, a small leather satchel containing strips of dried elk meat and hardtack, a single water barrel lashed securely to the sideboards, a coil of thick hemp rope, and a heavy pine box of hand tools. The tools were a wedding gift from her father, each one forged from Norwegian steel and handled in ash wood that had been rubbed with linseed oil until it glowed. She was heading south toward her brother Torsten's homestead near Sheridan, Wyoming. She estimated the distance was roughly 60 miles from where she now stood, a journey that Surtur could manage in 3 or 4 days if the weather held. But the trail was unpredictable, and the Bighorn Mountains to her west were already shrouded in a dense, silent white fog. The wagon groaned beneath her as Surtur struggled up the steep incline of the ridge. The left rear wheel wobbled on its worn iron hub, a loose, rhythmic clacking that had been her only companion for miles. The front axle was cracked, temporarily bound with raw hide and wire after a rough crossing at the Tongue River, and the tailgate hung loosely from a single broken hinge. It was a wreck of a wagon, a collection of dry-rotted pine and rusted bolts that no trader in Billings would have valued at $10. Yet, to Marta, it was her only shield against the empty land. She adjusted her woolen shawl, pulling it tight around her throat as she watched the trail ahead. The mud of the road had frozen into sharp, jagged ridges that threatened to shatter her wooden wheels with every turn. There were no trees here, no homesteads, no shelter of any kind for 20 miles. Only the vast, rolling sagebrush prairie, pale and dead under the sky. Marta pulled Surtur to a stop outside a small, rough-sawn timber outpost near the crossing of Crazy Woman Creek. The building was little more than a dirt-roofed cabin, its logs blackened by the soot of a poorly drawing chimney. Outside, a group of freighters were tending to a team of oxen, their breath rising in thick white clouds that vanished into the cold air. As Marta climbed down from the wagon, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy buffalo hide coat stepped out from the cabin. His name was Arthur Galt, a veteran trail freighter who had driven the Bozeman route for more than 15 years. He looked at Marta, then at her shivering mule, and finally at the loose, rattling hub of her wagon. He asked if she was heading south alone on a day like this, warning her that the wind was coming out of the north by nightfall and that she had a cracked axle and a mule that was already tired. Marta tied Surtur's reins to a hitching post, her movements slow and deliberate. She explained that her brother was in Sheridan, and with 60 miles left, waiting would allow the snow to lock the passes completely. Galt shook his head and argued that 60 miles was 3 days of hard driving for a strong team, let alone her single beast. He pointed to the sky, noting the clouds turning the color of an old bruise, and said she would be caught on the high ridge before she hit the Powder River. He asked if she even had a sheep herder stove in her box. When Marta replied that she had only her father's tools and her blankets, Galt called her a fool, gesturing toward the heavy canvas wall tents in his freight wagon. He insisted that winter out here did not argue. He told her she needed a heavy canvas tent, a sheet iron stove, and 3 cords of dry pine just to keep from freezing. He believed she had to fight the cold with fire, and that without a stove, she was as good as dead. Marta looked at Galt's massive freight wagon, loaded down with heavy iron stoves, dry split wood, and thick canvas. It was the traditional way of the frontier. Fight the wilderness with brute force and endless fuel. But she remembered her father, Arn, standing on the wind-swept headlands of the Hardanger Fjord, where the winter storms came off the Norwegian Sea with a violence that made the Wyoming plains look gentle. Her father had built temporary fish-drying huts on those exposed rocks, structures with no stoves, no chimneys, and no insulation. Yet, the fishermen survived the most brutal Arctic nights inside them. Her father's lesson had been simple and orderly. Shelter was not about making warmth. Shelter was about preventing its theft. Marta explained to him that fire was a demanding master that required constant feeding, and when the wood ran out, the cold returned instantly. She told him her father taught her that if you stop the wind completely, you do not need a fire to survive, because still air is the best insulation. Galt laughed, a loud, dismissive sound that made the oxen shift in their harnesses. He joked that stillness would not save her when the thermometer dropped to 30 below, and that she would freeze solid waiting for her stillness to warm her up. He advised her to turn back, buy some coal, and wait out the blow. Marta told him she could not wait, untied Surtur's reins, and climbed back onto the creaking wagon seat, noting that the wind was already starting to shift. Marta shook the reins, and Surtur leaned his weight into the harness, the cracked axle groaning as the wagon rolled away from the outpost. Behind her, Galt and the other freighters watched her go, their faces grim and silent. They had seen many travelers head south into the cold, and too many of them had been found in the spring, preserved in the drifts like logs. As the wagon climbed back onto the high ridge, the wind, which had been a steady, biting draft from the north, suddenly died. The silence that followed was absolute. Surtur stopped walking without any command from Marta, his long ears twitching as he sniffed the cold, heavy air. The landscape seemed to hold its breath. Marta stood up on the wooden seat and looked northwest. The sky was no longer gray. It had turned a flat, sickly yellow, a color that her father had always called the blizzard's eye. Below the dark, bruised wall of the storm front, she could see a pale, horizontal smear on the horizon, the telltale sign of wind-driven snow, scouring the dry grass miles away. The barometric pressure was dropping so fast that Marta felt a dull ache in her ears. The air was being pulled away, drawn into the massive atmospheric engine of the approaching storm. She had perhaps 40 minutes, perhaps less, before the wind returned with a force that would overturn her light wagon and freeze her where she sat. She looked at Surtur. The mule was trembling, his legs stiff, his head turned toward the low sandstone bluffs that broke the western edge of the ridge about a quarter-mile ahead. Marta did not whip the animal forward. She climbed down from the seat, walked to Surtur's head, and placed both hands on his cold muzzle. She spoke quietly to Surtur, telling him they could not outrun it and had to find a place to hide. She looked at the sandstone bluffs. They were not grand or dramatic, rising only 12 or 15 feet above the prairie, but their eastern faces were carved with shallow hollows and alcoves, worn away by centuries of wind and frost. She unhooked Surtur from the traces, leaving the wrecked wagon on the ridge. She led the mule toward the rocks, her father's heavy coil of rope slung over her shoulder, her mind focused entirely on a single goal, finding 3 walls of solid stone. If you want to see how these forgotten techniques of stillness and survival can save a life when modern convenience fails, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. We share the stories of ordinary people who survived the hardest blows nature could deliver by trusting in the quiet wisdom of the past. The silence on the ridge did not last. Within 10 minutes of leaving the trail, Marta heard a low, hollow hum rising from the northwest, a sound like a distant freight train crossing a wooden trestle. Surtur pulled against the lead rope, his hooves sliding on the frozen clay as he tried to turn back toward the outpost. Marta held him tight, her body leaning forward as she guided him toward the bluffs. The pale smear on the horizon had become a rolling, horizontal wall of white that swallowed the sagebrush hills one by one. The air grew rapidly colder, the temperature dropping 10 degrees in the time it took to cover 200 yards. Marta's breath rose in short, ragged gasps that froze instantly on the wool of her collar. She looked back at her wagon. It sat high on the ridge, its tattered canvas cover fluttering in the first light drafts of the storm front. It looked small and incredibly fragile against the vastness of the Wyoming sky. If she stayed with it, the wind would have stripped the heat from her body within an hour, even under her heavy blankets. The wood of the wagon was dry-rotted and cracked, unable to stop the air from threading through its seams. Marta reached the base of the bluffs just as the first flakes of dry, hard snow began to sting her face. The wind was beginning to rise, low whistling drafts that swirled around the sandstone formations, kicking up the dry sage leaves and frozen dirt. She led Surtur along the base of the rock, searching each hollow with a disciplined, orderly focus. The first alcove she found was too shallow, barely 4 feet deep, offering no protection from the wind that would soon curve around the edges of the bluff. The second was wider but had a cracked ceiling that would let in drifting snow as the blizzard built. She kept moving, her boots heavy, her hands numb inside her mitts, Surtur pressing his nose against her shoulder for warmth. The third hollow was different. It was a natural alcove, roughly 18 feet wide and 6 feet deep, carved into the eastern face of a massive sandstone bluff. The ceiling curved slightly inward at the top, creating a protective stone lip that would shed snow over the opening rather than let it accumulate inside. Marta stepped into the alcove and immediately felt the change. The air was still cold, but the biting draft of the rising wind was gone. The sandstone walls rose on 3 sides, solid, dry, and ancient, blocking the north and west winds completely. The dirt floor was dry, covered in a thin layer of fine sand that had swirled in during the dry summer months. She walked to the back of the alcove and touched the stone. It was cold, but it felt stable and solid. Her father had always told her that stone was the most honest material a builder could use because it did not lie about its strength. He used to tell her that a stone wall does not bend, it does not shrink, and it does not let the wind through its seams. But 3 walls were not enough. The opening of the alcove was 18 feet wide and 8 feet high, a massive gap that would allow the cold air to swirl inside once the storm reached its full intensity. Without a 4th wall, the alcove would become a wind trap, a natural funnel that would concentrate the cold and freeze her and Surtur where they stood. Marta tied Surtur to a sturdy scrub juniper that grew from a deep crack in the stone near the back of the hollow. The mule stood quietly, his head low, his body still trembling from the cold. Marta patted his shoulder, then turned and looked back toward the ridge. She had her 3 walls of rock. Now she had to go back to the ridge and bring her 4th wall down. The walk back to the ridge was a struggle. The wind had risen to 30 miles per hour, blowing the snow in horizontal sheets that made it difficult to see the trail. Marta kept her head down, her chin tucked into her collar, following her own footprints in the light snow before the wind could erase them. She reached the wagon just as the full force of the storm's vanguard struck. The wagon was shaking, the tattered canvas cover tearing free from the rear wooden boughs with a sharp cracking sound. Marta did not hesitate. She climbed into the wagon bed, her movements planned and methodical, and began pulling her possessions out. She threw the blankets, the Dutch oven, the satchel of dried meat, and the pine toolbox onto the snow. Then she took her father's heavy wood chisel and a splitting wedge from the box. The wagon bed was held to the front and rear running gear by 4 heavy iron bolts and a series of wooden stake pockets. Marta placed the splitting wedge against the rusted iron flange of the front axle mount and struck it hard with the back of her hand axe. The cold metal rang with a sharp, clear sound that was swallowed instantly by the roar of the wind. She struck it again and again, her arms aching, until the first bolt sheared off, the rusted iron head flying into the snow. She moved to the rear axle, her boots sliding on the wet wood of the wagon bed as the wind tried to push her off. The left rear wheel wobbled on its hub, the dry rotted wood of the spokes creaking under the strain. Marta ignored the cold. Her focus narrowed to the iron bolts. She sheared the second, then the third, and finally the 4th. The wagon bed, now free of its wheels and axles, sat flat on the frozen ground. It was a heavy wooden box, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, with solid pine sideboards 3 feet high. It weighed nearly 300 pounds, a dead weight that no single woman could lift or carry, let alone haul 400 yards through the snow. But Marta had her father's 60-foot coil of hemp rope. She ran the rope through the empty stake pockets along the front edge of the wagon bed, knotting it secure with a bowline that would not slip under tension. She wrapped the other end of the rope around her chest and shoulders, creating a crude harness over her wool coat. Leaning forward until her body was almost parallel to the ground, she dug her boots into the frozen clay and pulled. The wooden bed did not move. Marta took a deep breath, her lungs burning in the freezing air, and threw her entire weight into the rope, her knees bending, her thigh muscles straining until the wood creaked. With a sharp scraping sound, the wagon bed slid forward 6 inches, leaving a dark, raw scar in the frost-covered grass. Marta pulled again, her breath rising in short, white gasps as she established a slow, disciplined rhythm. Pull, slide, step, pull. The ground sloped gently downhill toward the bluffs, a natural advantage that she used to her full potential. It took her 40 minutes to cover the 400 yards. Her shoulders were raw, the thick rope cutting through her coat and into her collarbone with a dull, throbbing pain that made it difficult to lift her arms. But she did not stop. She dragged the heavy wooden box into the opening of the sandstone hollow, positioning it lengthwise across the center of the gap. She had her fourth wall. It was 3 feet high, 10 feet long, and constructed of solid 3-inch pine boards that would stop the wind completely. Above it, there was still an open gap of nearly 5 feet between the top of the wood and the overhanging stone ceiling. But the foundation of her defense was in place. Marta stood inside the hollow, her back against the sandstone wall as she studied the opening. The 10-foot wooden wagon bed covered the center of the 18-foot gap, but it left 4 feet of open space on either side and 5 feet of open space above. These gaps were dangerous avenues through which the wind would swirl once the blizzard reached its full strength. She went back to the wrecked running gear she had left near the trail. The front axle was cracked, but the heavy wooden tongue, a 10-foot pole of seasoned ash, was still intact. Marta used her handsaw to cut the tongue into 3 4-foot lengths. She did the same with the intact rear axle, creating 5 sturdy wooden studs. She carried these wooden studs back to the hollow and wedged them vertically into the sandstone crevices on either side of the wagon bed, creating a strong wooden framework that extended from the ground to the stone ceiling. Then she began gathering flat sandstone slabs from the base of the bluff, stacking them tight against the wooden studs. The stone stacking was a disciplined, step-by-step process. Marta selected each rock for its flat surface and weight, laying them in overlapping courses like the brickwork of a chimney. She packed the gaps between the rocks with wet clay she dug from the floor of the hollow, creating a solid, windproof wall of stone on either side of the wooden wagon bed. By the time she finished, the side gaps were closed completely. The only remaining opening was the 5-foot space above the wagon bed sideboards. Marta pulled her tattered canvas cover free from the wooden bows and stretched it tight across this upper opening, tying the corners to the sandstone cracks with short lengths of rope. The canvas billowed in the rising wind, but she weighted the upper edge with heavy sandstone rocks placed along the rock ledge. The material was worn and torn in places, but it formed a flexible barrier that would deflect the wind over the top of the bluff, leaving the air inside the hollow quiet and still. With the walls constructed and the canvas in place, Marta led Surtur into the hollow. The space was tight, roughly 12 feet deep and 18 feet wide, but with the wagon bed and stacked stone blocking the front, it felt secure. Surtur pressed his nose against Marta's shoulder, his breath warm and moist against her cheek. A draft animal like Surtur, weighing nearly 1,000 pounds, produces substantial metabolic heat, roughly 400 British thermal units per hour. In an open field, this warmth is lost instantly to the wind, but in a small, enclosed space, it represents a significant thermal asset. Marta's father had taught her that a living animal was the best heater a traveler could have, provided the space was small enough to capture the energy. But an airtight space with a large animal also presented a dangerous hazard: carbon dioxide and moisture buildup. If she sealed the hollow completely, Surtur's respiration would quickly saturate the air with water vapor, which would condense on the cold sandstone walls, freezing and creating a cold sink that would lower the temperature. Worse, the oxygen would deplete within hours. To prevent this, Marta constructed a simple buoyancy-driven ventilation system. She cut a small 2-inch vertical slit in the upper canvas, near the sandstone ceiling, creating an exhaust port for the warm, moist air to rise and escape. Then she left a matching, narrow gap at the base of her stone-stacked wall on the opposite side, creating a low-level intake for cold, fresh air. The physics of this system were elegant. Surtur's body heat would warm the air inside the hollow, causing it to expand and rise toward the sandstone ceiling, where it would carry the carbon dioxide and moisture out through the high vent. This rising column of warm air would draw in cold, fresh air through the low intake, establishing a slow, draft-free circulation that would keep the interior air dry and breathable without cooling the space. The wind was now screaming across the high ridge, a deafening roar that swirled snow around the bluffs. Marta worked quickly to complete the final ceiling of her wall. She gathered armfuls of the dry, brown prairie grass that grew along the slope of the bluff, dead since the September frosts, but still tough and abundant. She packed the grass tight into every remaining crevice between the wood of the wagon bed and the sandstone rock, using her father's wooden wedge to tamp the fibers deep into the cracks. The dry grass acted as a gasket, blocking the smallest streams of moving air. Wherever she felt a cool draft, she packed more grass until the draft stopped. Next, she scraped loose, damp clay from the floor of the hollow and packed it along the base of the wagon bed, sealing the gap between the wood and the uneven ground. The clay was cold, freezing almost as soon as she pressed it into place, but it formed a hard, airtight seal that anchored the wooden wall to the sandstone floor. The mule stood quietly behind her, his large body blocking some of the light that filtered through the canvas. Marta's fingers were completely numb, the skin raw and bleeding from the rough stone and frozen clay, but she ignored the pain. Her mind focused entirely on the completeness of her wall. She reminded herself that a gap was a leak, and a leak was a theft. She left a small 3-foot opening at the southern end of the wagon bed, just wide enough for her to crawl through if she needed to exit. Then she hung her second gray wool blanket over this opening, weighting the bottom edge with a heavy wooden stake. The wall was complete. It was not beautiful, it was not strong, but it had no gaps. And in a blizzard, that was the only thing that mattered. The blizzard struck the sandstone bluffs with its full, undivided force at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Inside the hollow, Marta could no longer see her own hand in front of her face. The darkness was total, broken only by the dim, white line of light that filtered through the narrow ventilation slit at the top of the canvas. The roar of the wind outside was deafening, a ceaseless, high-pitched shriek that sounded like 1,000 metal saws cutting through iron. The massive sandstone bluff vibrated under the impact, a low, rhythmic trembling that Marta could feel through her boots and against her back as she sat against the stone wall. But inside her pocket of stillness, the air was quiet. The draft-free environment she had constructed held Surtur's body heat, the temperature inside the hollow climbing slowly to nearly 30 degrees above zero, while outside, the wind chill fell to 70 below. The thin streams of moisture that had begun to condense on the cold sandstone walls froze almost instantly, sealing the grass packed into the crevices with a layer of wind-packed ice that bound the fibers together like mortar. The blizzard was helping her. Every minute of wind drove more dry, hard snow against the exterior of her wagon bed wall, building a massive drift that grew thicker and denser as the storm continued. This snowdrift, packed tight by the wind, acted as a natural insulation blanket, protecting her wooden stone wall from convective heat loss. By the 4th hour of the storm, the sound inside the hollow had changed. The sharp, metal shriek of the wind had become a distant, muffled hum, as though the storm were passing over a deep valley miles away. The snow had drifted completely over the wagon bed, burying her wall under a 4-foot shield of white. Marta sat on her canvas roll, her knees pulled tight against her chest, her gray wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Beside her, Surtur stood with his head low, his dark flank pressed against her left side, his massive body radiating a steady, comfortable warmth that seeped through her wool coat. The passive ventilation system worked exactly as she had calculated. The air inside remained dry and clean. The moisture from Surtur's breath carried out through the high vent before it could condense on the stone, while a slow, cold draft of fresh air seeped in through the low intake, keeping the space breathable. She slept. It was not a deep, peaceful sleep, but a shallow, survival-driven rest, her mind waking with every shift in Surtur's weight, every groan of the wooden stakes against the sandstone, every crack of the ice-coated canvas overhead. But she was warm. She was warmer than she had been in her own cabin during the mildest December freezes. Marta woke to an absolute, crushing silence. The low moan of the wind had stopped completely. She opened her eyes, and through the narrow ventilation slit at the top of the canvas, she saw a pale, clear line of blue light. The dawn had come. She stood up, her joints stiff and aching from the cold, and stretched her arms. Beside her, Surtur twitched his long ears and shook his head, a soft snort rising in a white cloud that hung in the still air of the hollow. Marta crawled to the southern end of the wagon bed and pushed against the wool blanket. It was rigid, frozen solid by the wind-driven snow that had packed against the outside. She used her father's heavy chisel to chip away the ice, working slowly until the blanket fell free, revealing a solid wall of white snow. She dug through the drift with her hands, her fingers cold but functional, until she broke through to the outside. The sudden brightness of the morning sun made her blink. She stepped out onto the snow and looked around. The world she had known the day before had been erased, replaced by a vast, featureless plain of white that stretched to the horizon under a cold, silent sky. The trail was gone. The scrub was gone. The world had been remade overnight into a single, featureless plain of white stretching in every direction. Marta led Surtur south along the high ridge, navigating by the position of the sun. The trail was buried under drifts that reached the bellies of her mule, but the air was perfectly, impossibly still. In that stillness, the sub-zero cold was not a threat. It was simply a quiet presence that hung over the white hills. It took her 4 days to cover the remaining 60 miles to Sheridan. She walked the entire distance, her boots sinking deep into the crust, leading Surtur by his leather reins. She had no wagon, no heavy tent, no iron stove, and only a single satchel of dried meat left, but she was alive. When she walked into her brother Torsten's yard on Tuesday morning, her face was red and windburned, her hands raw and scarred by sandstone and clay, but she was standing tall. Torsten was in the yard, splitting wood, his face showing the exhaustion of the storm that had nearly buried his own cabin. He stopped, the axe in his hand, and stared at his sister as though she were a ghost. The news had already reached Sheridan that 3 freighting teams had frozen to death on the high ridge during the first night of the blizzard. A recovery party had found them just 10 miles north, their bodies rigid, their fireboxes empty, their heavy canvas tents torn to ribbons by the wind. Torsten dropped his axe and ran toward her, his arms wrapping around her shoulders in a silent, trembling embrace. He told her they had thought they lost her, and that the storm had killed everyone it caught on the ridge. Marta looked back toward the trail and said quietly that the storm did not catch her because she had her father's tools. Dr. Ethan Cole, the physician in Sheridan, examined Marta and her mule the following morning. He sat at the kitchen table, his brass stethoscope in his hand, his expression a mixture of disbelief and wonder as he recorded her temperature and checked her fingers for frost damage. He told Torsten that it defied every medical rule, explaining that the freight teams had every modern shelter but froze because the wind stripped their heat faster than their stoves could replace it. He noted that Marta had nothing but a wooden wagon bed and a rock hollow, yet her body temperature was normal and her mule showed no signs of cold stress. Marta looked at her father's ashwood tools sitting in their pine box near the stove. She remembered Arthur Galt's warning about fighting the cold with fire. But she knew her father's rule was the true one. The freight teams had tried to make warmth, but they had failed to prevent its theft. By sealing every gap, she had created stillness, and in stillness, her body's own small fire had been enough. A profound emotional peace settled over Marta as she sat by her brother's stove. For 2 years, she had felt like a wrecked wagon herself, broken by her husband's debts, stripped of her home, and left to face the cold alone on an exposed trail. But she realized now that she was like the stone in the river. She did not need to be stronger than the current, she only needed to be complete. And she was complete. The story of Marta Solvorn's survival on the Bozeman Trail was told around the stoves of northern Wyoming for 50 years. It was the kind of story that frontier communities kept in their collective memory rather than in official records, passed down from one telling to the next as a testament to the quiet power of simple stillness over brute force. The sandstone hollow at Section 22 slowly returned to its ancient silence as the wagon wood rotted and the canvas turned to dust over the decades. Today, only a faint curve in the sandstone bluff remains, a place where wind and stone still meet, waiting for nothing. But her father's ashwood tools are still preserved in the state archives in Cheyenne, a silent reminder of a Norwegian shipwright's daughter who trusted in the quiet physics of stillness and survived when all the strength of the frontier had failed.